Good sports stories are never about sports. They're always about the human element.
Above the surface, it seemed like Charles Daniels had everything a person could want. But below the surface lurked a sea of personal troubles for which swimming would become the cure.
He was not good at sports. He was not a good athlete. His father was one of the rare people who knew how to swim. So we threw him in and said swim, and he nearly drowned. But when his father left him, I think he always wanted to prove himself to his dad.
Charles Daniels would grow up to prove himself to the world, and along the way help propel America's rise to dominance in Olympic swimming from its very modest beginnings at the start of the 20th century.
We had 75 million people back then. Only 600 swam competitively, and not very well. And the English and the Australians and really the Europeans were so much better than us.
St. Louis author and sports attorney Michael Loynd spent 2 years researching the life of Charles Daniels, including the critical part. The 1904 St. Louis Olympics played in his rise to international fame at a time when competitive swimming was a very different sport.
Back then, even in pools, they didn't have lane lines, they didn't have chlorine, they didn't have gutters. So they were dealing with all kinds of issues. And if you think about it, if you can't see the bottom of the pool and see a lane line, it's hard to swim in a straight line.
Loynd's new book, The Watermen, available at Left Bank Books, is the untold story of an American sports hero whose unfailing humility left him virtually forgotten, even to those who followed in his wake.
The wonderful thing about researching this book, I got to talk with some amazing swimmers like Mark Spitz, John Neighbor, Matt Biondi.
Did those famous swimmers know the story of Charles Daniels? Did they even know his name?
They vaguely knew his name, but they had no idea everything he did. It's a wonderful story. I think people will be thoroughly entertained, and I think it's his just due.
Michael Loynd, thanks very much for joining us today. Appreciate you being here.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So your previous work has been in the fiction area.
Yes.
This is your first nonfiction book. Why did you decide to make this topic your first nonfiction topic?
You know, I think just fate threw it in my lap. I love stories about hope and overcoming difficult obstacles. And this just had this, not only did it have a great underdog character, some good juicy villains, but it had this remarkable, fascinating, fresh background on the creation of swimming, which I never knew existed. And I was just riveted by it. And I love underdog stories. Point blank, they fill you with hope. They give you all those great emotions that we love. And studies have shown that they last, not in that fleeting moment, but for several days afterwards. And when you're in a book, you just dwell in it and you get to experience that all the more. And so I loved writing this book, and I hope people will get to enjoy all those great emotions.
Yeah, I have to confess that I don't like swimming. I don't watch swimming. And I was really fascinated by the details about the birth of swimming as we know it today, not just as an Olympic sport, but just as a preoccupation with people. People didn't used to swim very much.
No, not at all. Not at all, especially here in the United States. It started in England, the competitive swimming in the mid-1800s because of a pandemic, which is kind of interesting, timely today. People were being affected by cholera, and they had to build these Roman baths so people can get clean and stuff like that, and people started racing. And over here, it just didn't take so well. People still associated swimming with the dirty, the poor, the uncouth, and because of all the Puritanism here, it wasn't proper to be in that kind of state of dress amongst other people.
Yeah, I was really struck in the book where you're talking about the Victorian women had to wear so much clothing if they dared to wade into the water, would practically drown them.
Not practically, it did. A lot of the drownings were kids and women because they had to wear so much material. And some women would drown just in the shallows. They'd get roped around with their 13 pounds of fabric on and be pulled in. It was kind of sad, really.
It was kind of a two-pronged thing because people were afraid to go into the water, and yet when big events would come along like the Galveston flood where so many people drowned, then there was this big push for everybody to learn how to swim. We couldn't make up our minds about it.
Well, that's true. But again, we didn't have the infrastructure for it either.
Well, the central character in this underdog story, this underwater underdog story, I guess you could say, is Charles Daniels. This poor guy, he was from New York. He wasn't from St. Louis, but there's a great St. Louis connection that we'll get to. His life was just really difficult, and it should have been easy because he was born into great wealth.
His parents were very well-to-do in society in Buffalo, and his dad kind of became the Bernie Madoff of the day and really just threw them out of society. And he had walked out on them before that even happened. Just not a good guy. And the fact back then, if you were a woman and a child, you had probably the least rights in America. In fact, horses had more rights than children at the time. So it was just remarkable that they were able to hold it together and survive like they did.
How did he become interested in swimming? Was it because of his anxiety that he thought maybe this would be a calming place for him?
You know, ironically, it was his father who first threw him into the water. And back then, he did have very heavy anxiety. And back then, we didn't have the knowledge that we have today to deal with it. So their thought was, well, if men have it, you just need more physical, manly activity, and that will knock the nervousness out of you. If women had it, you just need to lay in bed forever. I mean, it's just kind of really warped thinking, but that was it. He was not good at sports. He was not a good athlete. His father was one of the rare people who knew how to swim. So he threw him in and said swim, and he nearly drowned. But when his father left him, I think he always wanted to prove himself to his dad. And swimming was what he chose to kind of connect with his absent father.
Well, and I think you mentioned several times in the book about Charles swimming and having this monster on his back when things would get tough. And that was his dad at some points, right?
Yeah, when I talk about the piano crashing on your back, that was, so the wonderful thing about researching this book, I got to talk with some amazing swimmers like Mark Spitz, John Neighbor, Matt Biondi, the list goes on. And they all talked about 100 meters going as hard as you can, not breathing, not getting the oxygen you need. At some point between 10, 20 meters from the final wall, you have this piano that just drops on your back. And it's just a monster, and you can't really move, and you just got to psychologically somehow push through it. I've never swam at that kind of level and that kind of peak. So, if I start feeling that, I just kind of slow down a little bit, but they don't have that option. So I thought that was fascinating.
Did those famous swimmers know the story of Charles Daniels? Did they even know his name?
Vaguely knew his name, but they had no idea everything he did. And even Mark Spitz, who broke his record for most medals in '72, wasn't really aware of everything because he was just a very humble person. And when his time was done, he wanted no more of the spotlight and just kind of faded off, which, again, makes him that much more of a compelling, good character.
So tell us how Charles went from being this kid, I don't know if sickly is the right word, but at least he had mental health issues and all of this problem with his family, to go from not being able to swim, not being a good athlete, to being a world-class athlete and a world-class swimmer.
We always need people in our lives to help us along the way, and he definitely had that at times. He had a teacher, a gym teacher, which was kind of rare at the time, who started scouting here in America. And scouting actually played a big part in just taking him out to the woods and easing his anxiety of everything that he's being bombarded with. And he was able to kind of find himself and gain a little confidence out in the Adirondacks. So that was a big part. And swimming was a part of that.
It was a summer camp, as I recall, right?
It was, yeah. They would go out to the Adirondacks and just literally pitch a tent on an island and spend 2 months there. And that's what they did. And his mother was very instrumental in making that happen. And that was a lot of Teddy Roosevelt. He had anxiety when he was young, and he was very vocal about the outdoors really saved him and brought him some strength and brought him out of his shell. And so that started to become more of a thing at the time.
Well, I guess part of it, too, is that swimming competitively in the United States wasn't really a thing. It was all the British.
No, it wasn't. They had 600 competitive swimmers. So you think we had 75 million people back then. only 600 swam competitively, and not very well. The only people that could really swim had access to year-round pools. There weren't many of those, maybe a dozen. Most of them were in elite athletic clubs, so it just wasn't a thing here, which is weird to think about, that we didn't have access to pools or swimming and whatnot. But yeah, we were very bad, and the English and the Australians and really the Europeans were so much better than us.
Well, and the British were not just occasionally sore losers; they were sort of sore winners. They were terrible.
They were, I think, because we were this upstart colony at one point, right? And we had passed them from an industrialization standpoint, but they still ruled the seas, and they had governed over a fourth of the world. But the water was theirs, and that really reflected in swimming. They did not want to be beaten in swimming. They did not want to be overtaken in sports in general, but especially swimming. So this guy created some problems for them.
So Charles Daniels grows up to be a good swimmer, a competitive swimmer, and he ends up here in St. Louis.
He does. So the 1904 World's Fair at the Olympics was the first major international event that he competed in. It was actually the first real international swimming event we had in the United States. And unlike a lot of the other Olympic sports activities at the time, a lot of foreigners participated in swimming. And a lot of people showed up to watch. Normally, the championships got only about 100 people to come and watch because nobody really cared. But there was a horrible steamship accident in New York that killed about 1,000 people. It was the worst disaster in New York history until the Twin Towers. And that got people thinking about swimming, because women and children died just 50 yards from the side, and had they only known how to swim or float, they would have survived. So people started getting interested in swimming, and he was there, and he was just starting to make a name for himself, and he won 5 medals here, 3 gold. And again, now the English and the Australians weren't here, which was another issue, but he made a name for himself, and he broke one of the England's world records, which they denied, but he did, and it was pretty amazing.
The gold medals for swimming were smaller?
They were small. They were like a $50 size. And one other point of wonderful fact for St. Louis, the gold medal started here. Before then, it didn't exist.
Do you find today that many people remember that we had the Olympics here in 1904?
I'd like to think that more people are getting to know it. I was on the committee to get the Olympic rings here at Washington University, so we at least have something to mark that event. And if you haven't seen them, they're beautiful. They're right by Francis Olympic Field, which is great. So I hope that message is spreading around our town, because the World's Fair were the biggest thing going at the time, and they got swallowed up. But I would say now the Olympics far exceed the World's Fair in prominence in today's world.
So our Olympic pool wasn't really a pool at all.
No.
And there weren't many pools for even the competitive swimmers.
No, the first Olympics they swam it in the Greek Sea, which was freezing and had waves and all kinds of stuff. Second Olympics was in Paris, and they swam it in the river there. This Olympics, they built just a man-made lake. Probably wasn't the cleanest, and they swam in that.
And just in swimming in those kind of conditions, as opposed to a pool, especially swimming in the sea or a river, it's a whole different thing.
Well, completely. And back then, even in pools, they didn't have lane lines, they didn't have chlorine, they didn't have gutters. So they were dealing with all kinds of issues. And if you think about it, if you can't see the bottom of the pool and see a lane line, it's hard to swim in a straight line. So they had all kinds of issues with that, too, without picking their head up and lifting to see where they were.
So part of his fame and his success is tied, I guess, to this swimming stroke, the crawl, that he more or less invented?
Yes. It came from Australia. It originally came from just Pacific Islanders who just naturally had this stroke. And Australians adapted it, did a little of their own tweaking with how the legs are kicked, but theirs was more clunky. They were swimming in salt water, so you had more buoyancy, and they could lift their legs 90 degrees and crash, and they synced it with their arms. And Charles Daniels was the one that said, that doesn't really work here. And he evolved it into what we know as the freestyle stroke with the 6-beat kick and the way the arms knife in and the breathing out the side of your mouth and everything like that. So.
How come they didn't name it after him? They've got all those names things that are named in skating.
Right. Well, at the time they just called it the American crawl, but that's ultimately what we call the freestyle today. And again, he was a very humble person, and he took the spotlight because he had to, because he was the face of U.S. swimming, and he wanted to see the culture succeed in America. But he was very humble and quiet, and when it was his time to go again, he just walked off and said, I'm good. You don't need me anymore.
And the real showdown for him came a few years later in England.
It did at the 1908 Olympics. So that was really the first big Olympics, because England was always the father of sport, the cradle of sport, and they finally acknowledged the Olympics because they basically wanted to beat the Americans. And they designed this pool. So it was the first Olympic pool, and it was 100 meters long. And they did that because Daniels was known for these great turns, and that's how they said he always was able to beat them. So they designed a 100-meter pool so he couldn't turn. And they thought that might do it. And of course, they added one more dastardly plan to make sure that he did not win and did not set any world records.
Well, we won't do a spoiler here.
Right.
You'll have to read the book, folks.
There you go.
But the other interesting thing about the book is it's sort of a two-track story. You've got the story of Charles Daniels, but you also have the story of the modern Olympics. And they were a mess.
They were an absolute mess. I did that because, and again, it's mostly about Charles Daniels, but to not have the origins of the Olympics and how much they evolved in those 10, 12 years would not have done justice to the story and would not have painted the picture of sports was so much in their infancy. And nobody wanted the Olympics back then. There just wasn't international travel back then. You had to be typically wealthy to do international travel and compete overseas. You'd have to take a month off. So you had to be an independent person of means. And that just wasn't readily accessible to most people. So most people saw the international competition like that as bizarre and strange and kind of a boondoggle. And England, of course, believing they were the best and the best athletes, they said, hey, if anybody wants to compete internationally, you can come to England and beat our athletes. You can beat our athletes, then you're the champion of the world, but you won't beat our athletes.
And there really wasn't a circuit like there is now below the Olympics to develop these athletes in any kind of an organized fashion, right?
No, not.
They just kind of, if they could pay their way to get there, they just showed up.
That's right. Definitely the first couple Olympics, and then we actually did form an Olympic committee that was able to raise money for sending athletes. But the interesting thing about that is they just focused on track and field. They did not want swimming. They did not plan to sponsor swimming. And it was only because Charles Daniels was doing so well and insisting that they have a swim team that they sponsored 4 swimmers for the Olympics.
Talking about the wealthy being the ones who were traveling, you've got a great sort of a side note in there about these American women who were marrying British men for their titles. It was like a sport in itself almost.
It was. And again, that just gets to the whole British and American culture. And we still didn't really have a great identity of ourselves. So the wealthy in our country still kind of glommed on to the class system of England, the Victorianism of England, which is really oppressive for a lot of people. And it was during this time, and swimming played a big part in breaking through that, because Victorianism, the women had to wear clothing from their neck to their ankles. Swimming, when it finally broke through, they couldn't swim in gowns. They had to swim in more of men's suits. And that opened the door for women's fashion, and it also opened the door for women competing in sports, because before then, women weren't allowed to compete because they sweat. People didn't want to see them sweat. But swimming allowed them to compete at that level because you didn't see them sweat. But it broke the door for track and field and everything else, too.
So here's sort of a process question. You're getting ready to think about writing this book, and you're learning about Charles Daniels and probably didn't know about all these little things that were involved with the birth of swimming.
Yeah.
As you started to discover those, were you like, oh, this is a great story?
Oh, I was pulsating, right? It's just everything you found out was, oh my gosh, I didn't know this. Oh my gosh, I didn't know this. This is so exciting. So it was fascinating. And to tell the story well, you have to understand the time, and you have to put all the time into the research to really get into the swimmer's head and understand all the things that they were facing, the obstacles, the challenges, all that. So I enjoyed every minute of the research. Like you said, there were just so many wonderful nuggets that just came forth that were wonderful.
And I imagine you were trying to gather all this information in the midst of COVID, which couldn't have made things any easier.
I was. It didn't make it easier, but it also gave me a little more time to research and write. But you're right. One of the last things I did was go down to the International Swimming Hall of Fame, to their archives. So they were closed all through COVID, and I knew I needed to get to it because they had all these files of swimmers around Charles Daniels that I knew I needed to kind of color the full picture and to flesh out some of the characters around him. And I literally, my deadline to Random House was a month away, and after hounding the International Swimming Hall of Fame, I got a call from Bruce Weigo, who's the former president. He said, "Hey, Harry, you've been really trying to get a hold of us. I'll be down here to open up the archives for you next week if you can get down there." I said, "I'll be there Monday." And I spent 3 days down there. Bruce was wonderful and found just great material. So it was perfect.
I have to assume you got some stuff from their family, too. You mentioned in the book on several occasions this sort of really sweet sort of side story about his mother.
Yeah.
Keeping all these clippings all the time.
I did. So that was another great thing. So I found out that he had 2 granddaughters who were still alive. So he wrote them a letter, and they responded, and they said, "Well, if you're interested in the story, why don't you come visit us?" I think they wanted to see how serious I was about telling the story. So I said, "I will visit both of you." One was out in Carmel, and the other was in Wisconsin. Went up, and after talking to them for a half hour, I think they trusted me enough that she said, "Well, wait a second, sit here, I'm going to get something." She went to her back room and she brought out these 2 huge scrap albums. And they had all these clippings and there were all these wonderful things about them. And she said, "Well, my sister has the other half." So I went out to Carmel and she had that, his baby book and a bunch of other things. And it really told a lot about his story, and his mother was the one who put those together, so it told a lot about her.
Had anything really, other than newspaper accounts, been written about Charles Daniels before your book?
Nothing.
I mean, I was wondering why they were so skeptical. I would think, if anything, they'd be like, "Oh, God, yeah, come on in, write all about him."
I wondered if they just, I think it was a private thing for them, but they're excited to get it out now. I know they were thrilled to read the book, so.
So after Charles Daniels has this remarkable career, he, as we sort of alluded to before, just kind of vanished from public life, except I guess going around and trying to encourage people to swim, sort of like Jack LaLanne or something.
He did.
To do that. Tell us a little bit more about what happened to him after his career as an athlete came to an end.
Yeah, so his career came to an athlete right around 1912 when we were actually about to go into another Olympics. They wanted him to swim, and he said, "No, I'm done. I feel our team's ready, and if I'm there, it'll just put the spotlight more on me, and we need to show that we can do this without me." Which they did, which was wonderful in and of itself. But afterwards, yes, he did swim. He swam every day. They said in the lake in the Adirondacks. They built a house up there. But then he also came out during World War I, and he joined the Navy to help our naval men learn how to swim. World War II, he did the exact same thing. So he was always there to come out when needed. And I just, again, but he was very humble. He did become an excellent golfer in his retirement time. He won the California Senior PGA twice, which I thought was kind of neat. So he never lost that competitive spirit. Despite his humility, he still liked to compete.
Yeah, he's a very humble guy.
He was. Although the granddaughters used to say he loved to play cards and was really good at it. So he'd show up at some of the clubs around the area and he'd play people for beer money, and he got a kick out of that. So, which is great. But they said, even the granddaughters said they did not know a lot about his background and history because he just didn't talk about it.
And he had a job too, right?
He sold insurance for quite a while, but he married a very wealthy individual, so he didn't have to work, but he still, like I said, was involved with the swimming movement and everything like that.
What does swimming owe to Charles Daniels today?
I'm sure from him, because he's so humble, he'd say nothing. I was happy to be the person that, moved that forward, and Godspeed everybody else. So I don't know if it does, but I do think I would love people to see where the origins of swimming came from, and just, again, the hope and determination and the obstacles that this one person had to overcome to make it a cultural institution for all of us. It's a wonderful story. I think people will be thoroughly entertained, and I think it's his just due.
I've seen comparisons to the story of Seabiscuit.
Yes.
Which was so popular as a book and became a movie.
Yeah.
Are you thinking that this could become a movie?
We'll see. We'll see. But I will say, to give a note to Laura Hillenbrand, who wrote Seabiscuit, she kind of cracked the code on narrative nonfiction as far as a sports angle. But good sports stories are never about sports. They're always about the human element, and I hope this conveys that. And I actually just wrote her a note just saying, look, I reverse engineered your book. I picked it apart. I analyzed it. It was a masterclass for me. And I really patterned my book after the Seabiscuit, and she did a wonderful job.
Well, and the St. Louis County Library series is something that you've attended before and have kind of looked at that as a way to instruct yourself about how to get out there and talk about a book.
Yes, that's true. And it's always fun to meet the author of any book that you enjoy. So I do like to get out to those when I can. I mean, it's been a couple years without COVID, but I did go to Brad Meltzer when he was in town, which was wonderful.
How was it that St. Louis actually managed to get the Olympics? Was it just because of the World's Fair, which I guess was delayed by a year too?
It was, and that helped them get the Olympics because Chicago actually had it. And because all the money and all the resources were coming to St. Louis, again, they didn't have TV, they didn't have radio, so the only way you were going to see these events is if you came there in person. And everybody was spending what little money they had to come to St. Louis. So they said, look, we're not going to have two competing sports competitions. St. Louis had the amateur athletic championships here, so Chicago said, okay, fine, you're right, we concede. They'll go there because you have all the money and you're building all the venues. So we got it.
Do you think we'd ever host the Olympics again?
There's such an enormous endeavor. There are some real benefits, I guess, to hosting an Olympics. But again, in today's environment, it would need to make sense. But I wouldn't rule it out. It's funny, Athens and Paris and London, the first four, those three have all gotten another one. We haven't. So
we're due.
We're due, right? We're bigger than Athens, right?
I wonder if you think that what Charles Daniels did was less of an accomplishment because things were so irregular in his day, or more of an accomplishment because things were so irregular in his day when it comes to swimming?
I would say definitely more of an accomplishment because he was at the ground floor of a new sport, certainly here in America, and he had to kind of pave the way. And when you look at the outfits they swam in and how they had to swim, and no goggles, no nothing, it was pretty remarkable what he was able to do and accomplish. And just the fact that he was able to bring this to our country when you didn't have mass media like we do today.
Have you heard from the granddaughters of Charles Daniels about the book? What do they say?
I have. So they just got it a couple days ago. So they were very excited to get it. I hope to hear back from them in the next couple days.
That'll be neat. I'm sure they'll love it.
Yeah, but they were thrilled to get their hands on it.
Well, it's a great read, and we really appreciate you coming by. Michael Loynd, good luck with the book.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me.